When the boardroom lights dimmed at that night, everyone thought it was just another executive meeting, routine, decisive, controlled. But when they blindsided Marcus Hale, the only black CEO the company ever had, and stripped him of power without even a formal vote, they didn't realize they were lighting the fuse of their own downfall. Marcus had built the company from the ground up, turning a crumbling venture into a billion-dollar empire. What they didn't know was that behind his calm resignation lay a secret deal, one so meticulously crafted that it would unravel their fortunes overnight. By the time the board woke up the next morning, their empire had turned to dust, and the man they humiliated was the only one left standing with the keys to everything they'd lost. The tension in the glass-walled boardroom was thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared to breathe too loud. The long mahogany table gleamed under the soft light, reflecting faces that carried a mix of arrogance, greed, and subtle guilt. At the head of that table sat Marcus Hale, a man whose calm demeanor masked the storm brewing beneath. His tailored charcoal suit, his steady eyes, and his measured words had built empires from dust. For nearly a decade, he had been the backbone of Hale Tech Industries, a name synonymous with innovation and integrity. But tonight, the very people who had once toasted his leadership were preparing to cut him out like a tumor. They thought they were being discreet, that their whispered conversations and sudden private meetings escaped his attention. What they didn't know was that Marcus had already read every email, every message, every carefully phrased lie, as the board members filed in. Pretending to greet him with the same hollow warmth as always, Marcus simply nodded, his mind sharp, cataloging every smirk and sidelong glance. The chairman, Richard Voss, a man with slicked-back silver hair and a reputation for manipulation, took his seat with a smug smile. He had always envied Marcus the respect he commanded, the loyalty of the staff, the way investors listened when he spoke. Richard had been waiting for this moment for years. He glanced around the table, exchanging silent nods with the other conspirators. Everyone knew the agenda wasn't what it seemed. The document labeled Strategic Transition Plan was just a polite disguise for what it really was: a coup. When the meeting began, Richard cleared his throat and started speaking in that insincere, rehearsed tone politicians used when they pretend to care. "Marcus," he said, "we've been reviewing some of the company's recent performance metrics, and while your leadership has been invaluable, certain directions have raised concerns among the board." Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. He just leaned back slightly, folding his hands as if he were watching a play he'd already seen. One by one, the others chimed in. Carefully chosen phrases like strategic misalignment, new vision, and fresh direction floated through the room like poison gas. They were firing him, but not with honesty or dignity. They were wrapping their betrayal in corporate jargon, hoping it would soften the cruelty. Marcus let them speak. He wanted to hear it all. Every excuse, every justification. His silence unnerved them. When Richard finally reached the end of his speech, there was a heavy pause. The air seemed to throb with anticipation. Marcus leaned forward slowly, his voice steady. "I see," he said quietly. "And when was this vote held?" The question froze Richard mid. "Well," he stammered, "it's more of a collective understanding among the board members." "We felt," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharper now. "You felt? That's not a vote. You didn't even call one." His eyes scanned the room, meeting each of theirs. "Do any of you have documentation? Any record that a formal vote was conducted?" Silence answered him. The board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Legally, their move was invalid. But Marcus knew they didn't care about legality. Not tonight. They were counting on power and politics, not the law. The arrogance in their faces told him everything he needed to know. They thought he'd accept it quietly, that he'd leave with grace and let them strip away the empire he built. Richard leaned back in his chair, smiling again, though his confidence was starting to crack. "Marcus," he said, "let's not get technical. The decision has been made. You'll be compensated fairly. The company appreciates your service." The words landed like daggers. Fair compensation, appreciation, empty gestures to disguise the theft of everything he had worked for. Marcus took a long breath. He wasn't the kind of man to beg or plead. He knew what was coming long before this meeting ever started. The weeks leading up to it had been filled with subtle betrayals, board members avoiding his calls, financial decisions made without his approval, contracts signed behind closed doors. He had seen the pattern forming, and he had prepared accordingly. What they didn't know was that every strategic move he'd made in the past 6 months wasn't just to grow the company, it was to safeguard his position, to build leverage that couldn't be taken from him. But tonight wasn't the time to reveal that. Not yet. Tonight was for letting them believe they'd won. As the meeting continued, Richard tried to formalize the decision. He pushed a few documents toward Marcus, gesturing for him to sign. "It's a standard separation agreement," Richard said. "You'll step down effective immediately. We'll announce the leadership transition tomorrow." The other board members nodded, eager to move on. Some even avoided eye contact, their guilt flickering across their faces like shadows. Marcus picked up the pen and stared at the paper. He read every line slowly, methodically. The silence in the room was deafening. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You're sure this is the path you want to take?" he asked, his tone calm, almost polite. Richard's smile widened. "Absolutely. It's what's best for the company." Marcus placed the pen on the table and stood. He didn't sign. He didn't argue. He simply looked around the room, meeting each face one last time. "Very well," he said quietly. "You've made your decision." His words carried a weight they didn't understand. To them, it sounded like resignation. To him, it was a signal, the beginning of something they couldn't foresee. He walked out of that room without looking back, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hall like a countdown. Behind him, the board members exhaled in relief, mistaking his composure for defeat. They laughed softly, congratulated each other, and began to plan the press release that would announce their strategic change in leadership. None of them noticed the slight curl of a smile that had touched Marcus's lips as he exited the building. None of them realized that the very signatures they had been so eager to forge tonight would soon be the same ones that sealed their downfall. They thought they had outsmarted him, but in truth, they had just played their part in a plan far bigger than they could comprehend. The board had conspired in the shadows, but Marcus had built his empire in the light, and he understood one thing better than any of them: when you build something with integrity, those who destroy it only end up destroying themselves. Marcus spent the night alone in his penthouse office, the city lights flickering below like stars trapped in glass. The faint hum of traffic, the steady ticking of the clock, and the glow of multiple monitors filled the room with a strange calm. Every document, every file, every signature that had passed through the company's veins was already in his possession. He had built HealthTech not only as a corporation but as a system, a living organism that he could control from the inside out. When he first became CEO, he made sure every innovation, every acquisition, and every licensing deal was routed through a network of subsidiary partnerships, all of which led back to a holding entity that only he fully understood. He had designed the corporate structure like a puzzle, one that appeared ordinary on the surface, but hid its true power behind layers of legal precision and strategic misdirection. The board thought they had removed him from power, but what they didn't know was that the company's foundation was no longer under their control. He sat at his desk, eyes fixed on a single document, the cornerstone of his secret deal. Months ago, anticipating betrayal, he had negotiated a private merger agreement with an international investment consortium under the alias MH Equity Partners. On paper, it appeared to be an independent investor group, but in truth, it was Marcus himself. Through that entity, he had gradually purchased controlling interests in HealthTech's key subsidiaries, the software division, the manufacturing rights, and most importantly, the patent licensing arm that generated 70% of the company's revenue. Each transaction had been perfectly legal, approved by the same board that now thought they had ousted him. He had even allowed them to believe these were routine capital expansions. By the time they realized what had happened, they would learn that HealthTech's most valuable assets were no longer theirs to command. Marcus leaned back in his chair, scrolling through the files, reviewing each clause and amendment like a chess player, replaying his winning moves. He remembered every moment that led him here, the patronizing looks during early meetings, the whispered doubts about his leadership, the thinly veiled racism that followed him through his rise. They called him too ambitious, too independent, too difficult to control. But now, their words didn't matter. What mattered was that the same arrogance that blinded them had made them sign away their own power. He remembered how Richard Voss once told him, "Always keep your investors happy, Marcus. They're the real owners." Marcus had smiled back then, knowing that one day, those investors would be him. In the digital vaults of the company's encrypted servers, the merger documents sat waiting for execution. With a few keystrokes, Marcus could trigger the final clause, a transfer of ownership that would make MH Equity Partners the majority shareholder in HealthTech's primary assets. He had structured the deal so that it would only activate under one condition: his official termination as CEO. That clause had seemed meaningless when he first proposed it to the legal department. A minor detail buried in pages of legal language, but that clause was the trigger, and tonight, the board had unknowingly pulled it. He smiled faintly as he watched the system verify the board's removal notice, automatically executing the terms of the agreement. Within minutes, the ownership of HealthTech's intellectual property, its overseas factories, and its core technologies shifted quietly into Marcus's control. Across the city, financial servers began to update, stock algorithms adjusted, and analysts started to notice sudden movement in the company's internal structure. But none of that would make sense to the board until morning. Marcus wasn't doing this out of vengeance, it was about balance. They had tried to strip him of everything, but he had built a failsafe, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. For years, he had watched corporate predators devour the work of visionaries, dismantle legacies, and discard creators. He had sworn that would never happen to him. Tonight, his foresight became his armor. The night deepened, and Marcus poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the city lights. He opened his secure terminal and drafted an email. It was short, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. Effective immediately, it read, "HealthTech's proprietary divisions are being restructured under new management as per the conditions of the MH Equity merger. All licensing agreements remain valid under the new ownership." He sent it to the legal and operations departments, knowing it would trigger internal alerts by dawn. By the time the board tried to reverse what they had done, the contracts would already be finalized. The law would be on his side, and the company they had stolen from him would no longer exist in the form they thought they owned. In the quiet moments that followed, Marcus reflected on how easily power changed hands, not through brute force, but through knowledge. He thought about how every CEO before him had relied on loyalty, yet failed to understand the language of control written in contracts and shares. The real power was never in titles or offices. It was in the fine print, the clauses no one else bothered to read. That was where empires were built and destroyed. Marcus had spent years mastering that language, not because he wanted to rule, but because he wanted to protect what he had built from those who would destroy it for profit. He walked to the window, looking down at the city that had watched him rise. Somewhere below, people were still working late in Hale Tech's offices, unaware that the future of their company had just changed hands. He could almost hear the laughter from the boardroom earlier that evening, the way they congratulated themselves after he left. They thought the company would bend to their will now that they had silenced him. But Marcus had turned their ambition into the mechanism of their defeat. Every signature they had placed on those so-called expansion documents had been their own undoing. He opened another folder, the financial contingency plan. It detailed how, within 24 hours, the newly owned subsidiaries would pull their contracts with Hale Tech, rendering the parent corporation the company's market value would plummet overnight, shares would freeze, and bankruptcy filings would become inevitable. Investors would panic, lawsuits would fly, and the same board that had arrogantly ousted him would have to explain how they allowed the company to lose everything in a single day. Marcus didn't have to lift a finger. The system was already in motion. The thought of revenge didn't bring him satisfaction. What filled him instead was a sense of justice, quiet and unspoken. They had underestimated him because of who he was, because of the color of his skin. The board members gathered again the next morning, their faces lit with satisfaction and They believed they had rid themselves of a man they saw as an obstacle, a reminder that true leadership didn't need privilege to command respect. The company's public relations team was already drafting a statement, calling Marcus's departure a mutual decision for new strategic direction. Richard Voss arrived early, sipping espresso and bragging to the others about how smooth the transition would be. The room buzzed with quiet triumph, yet beneath the surface, an unease lingered. Something felt off. Their phones kept vibrating with notifications, emails flooding in faster than usual. They ignored them at first, convinced it was routine chaos after a CEO's removal. But as the minutes ticked by, the smiles began to fade. One of the financial directors, a young analyst named Evelyn, looked pale as she scrolled through her laptop. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think you need to see this." Richard frowned, annoyed. "What now?" She turned her screen toward him. "Our main software division. It's not showing under our ownership anymore. The database lists it under MH Equity Partners." Richard's irritation turned to disbelief. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "Check again." She did. Same result? Another executive opened his own system, trying to verify it, only to find that the patents, the licensing rights, even the global manufacturing contracts were no longer under Hale Tech Industries' portfolio. Panic began to ripple through the room. The company they thought they controlled had been hollowed out overnight. Richard stood up, his voice rising. "Get the legal team in here now. Call the CFO. Find out what this MH Equity thing is." The room became a frenzy of noise. Phones ringing, papers rustling, voices colliding in chaos. Within half an hour, the truth started to take shape. The secret merger agreement had gone into effect automatically after Marcus's termination, transferring every major asset to MH Equity Partners. The company they had stripped him of was now nothing but an empty shell, stripped of its revenue sources and contractual power. What they didn't realize yet was that Marcus Hale was MH Equity Partners. He had hidden his ownership behind a web of offshore entities, trusts, and proxy signatures that even the best investigators would struggle to trace. By the time they pieced it together, it was too late. The CFO burst into the room, sweating, clutching a stack of reports. "We've lost control of everything," he said breathlessly. "Every core division, every licensing agreement, every asset worth anything has been reassigned. Our accounts are freezing. The banks are flagging our transactions." The room fell silent except for the sound of Richard's cup shattering against the floor. "How?" he demanded. "How could this happen?" The CFO hesitated before answering. "It looks like the contracts were the board approved them months ago under the expansion initiative. The merger clause triggered automatically when Marcus's termination was processed." For the first time, real fear filled the boardroom. Their arrogance, their greed, their assumption that Marcus was just another expendable executive had blinded them completely. They hadn't even bothered to read the fine print in the contracts they'd authorized. Marcus had played them with their own signatures. The company's financial systems began to crash one by one, alarms flashing across the monitors. Trading bots picked up the irregularities within minutes, and by the time the stock market opened, Hale Tech shares were plummeting at an unprecedented rate. Investors demanded answers. Journalists began calling, and social media exploded with speculation. What happened to Hale Tech became the top trending question of the day. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus sat in a private office, watching the chaos unfold on his screens. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply observed as justice took its course. He had no need to say a word. The system was speaking for him. Every alert, every drop in stock value, every headline that appeared was a reflection of their betrayal unraveling. For years they had treated him as if he didn't belong in the room he had built with his own hands. Now they were learning what it felt like to lose everything they believed was theirs. The difference was, Marcus hadn't stolen it. He had only taken back what they tried to take from him. Back in the boardroom, the investors' calls turned desperate. Lawsuits began to pour in. The media camped outside the company headquarters as news broke that Hale-Tech's patents and manufacturing contracts were no longer under its name. Richard's face was ashen as he tried to hold a press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and every attempt to spin the story only made it worse. The company remained stable, he said shakily, but stability was a lie. Within hours, the company's valuation dropped by nearly 80%. Analysts called it one of the fastest corporate collapses in history. Employees began resigning, fearing unpaid salaries and broken contracts. The once untouchable empire of Hale-Tech was reduced to rubble, and the man they had humiliated was now its sole survivor. Richard sat in his office long after everyone had left, staring at the financial statements. The zeros on the screen mocked him. Everything he had worked for, his bonuses, his shares, his influence evaporated in less than 24 hours. He picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number, not expecting an answer. But Marcus answered. "I assume you've seen the reports," Marcus said calmly. Richard's voice was trembling. "Marcus, what did you do?" There was a long pause. "I protected what was mine," Marcus replied. "You tried to take it without honor, without process, without even a vote. You thought power was about majority, but it's about preparation." Richard tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The line went dead. Across the next few days, the fallout deepened. Hale-Tech filed for bankruptcy protection. Investigations began, revealing that the board had violated multiple corporate governance rules by firing Marcus without due process. Shareholders sued for negligence. Government regulators opened inquiries. Richard and several others resigned under pressure, their reputations ruined. Marcus, meanwhile, emerged quietly in the media as the new owner of Hale Global Systems, a company that now held all of Hale-Tech's original assets under a new name. The irony wasn't lost on the world. The man they tried to erase had become the architect of their downfall and the rebirth of the very empire they destroyed. In the corridors of power and finance, whispers began to spread about what Marcus had done. Some called it revenge. Others called it brilliance. But to those who understood business, it was something else entirely. The perfect execution of foresight. Marcus hadn't acted out of rage. He had simply built a system that rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal. He had given them the rope, and they had used it to hang themselves. As the headlines faded and the dust settled, the world saw Marcus not as a victim, but as a strategist who had played by their rules and still won. The board that had once mocked his confidence was gone. Their legacies erased, their fortunes tied up in legal battles. Marcus, however, stood unshaken, a quiet reminder that power built on deception never lasts. He didn't need to announce his victory. The silence that followed was enough. The empire they tried to strip from him had crumbled under its own greed, while his vision rose again, stronger and untouchable. The world would move on, markets would recover. But the story of Hale-Tech's collapse, and the man who turned betrayal into triumph, would remain a legend whispered in boardrooms for years to come.